Hi everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Evolutions in the EU IVD Regulatory Framework. My name is Sarah Steck, and I'm the Legal and Regulatory Director here at LNEG Med North America. As I'm sure you're all aware, the European Commission presented its revisions to the current IVD regulatory scheme at the end of 2012, and the current amendments are making their way through the EU legislative process as we speak. The proposed changes, if the revision is made into a regulation, bring some pretty major changes to both economic and regulatory actors in the IVD arena. Today, we'll examine some of the major changes that are in the current IVD regulation proposal and the amendment documents, including new classification and conformity assessment routes. Now, keep in mind that these proposals are still just proposals. The EU Parliament and Council must analyze and vote on the text of the proposed regulation, even though the Parliament has already voted once on it. So, there may be amendments and changes that are still made between now and when we actually have a regulation to work with. We'll have a bit of time at the end to answer questions, but the question and answer boxes and chat boxes will stay up for you to submit your questions. After the webinar, if we don't get to your question during the question and answer time, we'll answer them and send you the answers in a couple weeks. Or, if you can't wait that long, you're more than welcome to send us an email or give us a call. The last slide will have our phone number as well as our email address. And as many of you know, we like to pick up the phone and we're pretty responsive over email, so you're sure to get a response. Also, if you have any technical issues, please let us know by typing it into the chat box and we'll try and solve them. So now, let's get started. First, we'll go over why the IVD regulatory scheme is changing in the first place. What were the EU Commission's goals and how did it hope to achieve them? Then, we'll get into the proposal and the amendments themselves and talk about some of the major changes that are specific to IVDs in the regulation. For example, we'll go over the new definition and scope, new requirements for economic and regulatory actors, the new classification and conformity assessment rules. I'll talk about the summary of safety and clinical performance, what are the EU Reference Laboratories, and finally, I'll mention the clinical evaluation requirements. So now that we know where we're going, let's get moving. First, to lay the groundwork, let's take a look at why the regulatory scheme is changing in the first place. The IVD Directive has been around for a long time, so why did they want to change it? The European Commission had a few objectives in mind when drafting the revisions to the medical devices and IVD regulations. It had started a few years ago, thinking and inviting discussion on what should be the changes, what they should focus on, etc. For these revisions, the Commission focused on three major or overarching objectives. First, to ensure that human health and safety is protected at a high level. Second, to ensure the internal market functions smoothly. And third, to provide a consistent regulatory framework that supports innovation and competition. As you read the revisions, which we absolutely and without question highly recommend you do, you'll see pretty clearly the path that the Commission is taking to meet these objectives. First, for example, there are added requirements for clinical studies for medical devices and IVDs, and increased post-market surveillance and vigilance requirements. Second, to ensure the internal market functions smoothly, the Commission focused on smoothing out the differences between the different member states' interpretations of the directives. You may ask how the different member states' interpretations relate to the smooth functioning of the internal market. Well, as many of you are probably aware, the different competent authorities may have interpreted the directives differently, and these different interpretations could have a big impact on a medical device manufacturer. For example, if one competent authority considered a borderline device to be a drug, and another considers the same borderline device to be a medicine. A regulation, unlike a directive, isn't translated into the different member states' national laws, and so applies to all member states in the same way. The Commission's revisions iron out these wrinkles to ensure that the internal market functions as smoothly as possible. Finally, the Commission's objective to provide a consistent regulatory framework that supports innovation and competition can be seen not only in the revisions, but the impact statements as well. There, you'll see all the options and arguments the Commission considered in making its decision and how it weighed each option. Now, you may be wondering what the difference is between a regulation and a directive. Well, the answer is that there are a few differences. The first difference is how they apply. A regulation applies directly to all member states in the same way, whereas a directive must be transposed into each member state's national law. The revision, because it's in the form of a regulation, will be more specific than the directive. You can see the additional specificity, for example, when we get into the different actors' obligations and extra requirements. Many obligations that were assumed or barely mentioned in the directive are spelled out completely in the revision. Also, the regulation binds many more regulatory actors than the directive. You'll see more later, but a quick example is that the EU Commission now takes a much larger role in the medical device approval process than before. So now that we're all starting off on the same foot, let's get into the meat of why we're here today, the major changes in the proposed IVD regulation. Now, we're going over a lot of the major changes in the proposed IVD regulation. Between the two medical devices directives, the IVD directive underwent the largest overhaul of the two regulatory schemes. First, we'll go over some of the major changes to the definition and scope of the proposal. Because this is a regulation, there are a lot more definitions than there were in the IVD directive, going into much more detail than before. However, we'll focus on the major ones. Then we'll quickly get into a discussion on the economic and regulatory actors. The duties for each are spelled out in much more detail in the proposal, so we'll go over each one. We'll then mention one of the new actors, specifically the EU Reference Laboratories. Next, we have the changed classification scheme and the new Conformity Assessments. As a result of these, there will be many more IVDs that would require a notified body for their CE marking. Finally, we'll wrap it up by talking about a few new requirements for IVD manufacturers, the summary of safety and clinical performance, and the revamped clinical evaluation requirements. And with that, let's get started. Just like for medical devices, the proposed IVD regulation changes the scope of the types of medical devices that it applies to, which is broader than the IVD directive. What is included in the regulation are medical devices that meet the definition of an IVD and two new specifics: IVDs that are used for DNA testing and IVDs that are used for genetic testing. These two categories weren't mentioned in the IVD directive, and as technology has progressed, have proved to be a regulatory gray area. In addition, the amendments from the EU Parliament add a provision that the devices for genetic testing are not to be marketed directly to consumers and can only be available by prescription. This is contrary to the situation today, where you have a lot of genetic testing companies that market their services directly to clients. Later on in the regulation, the Commission includes specific rules that deal with genetic and DNA tests. There are also exclusions to the scope, but these aren't necessarily new. First, products for general laboratory use are excluded, unless the manufacturer specifically intends them to be an IVD. Second, invasive sampling devices, or those which directly apply to the human body for the purpose of obtaining a specimen, also aren't IVDs. Finally, higher metrological order reference materials also aren't IVDs. The definition of an IVD hasn't changed much, but it has expanded with the new regulation. The new definition states that an IVD is any medical device which is a reagent, reagent product, calibrator, control material, kit, instrument, apparatus, equipment, software, or system, whether used alone or in combination, intended by the manufacturer to be used in vitro for the examination of specimens, including blood and tissue donations, derived from the human body, solely or principally for the purpose of providing information concerning a physiological or pathological state, concerning a congenital abnormality, concerning the predisposition to a medical condition or a disease, to determine the safety and compatibility with potential recipients, to predict treatment response or reactions, or to define or monitor therapeutic measures. So the definition is similar to what was in the IVD Directive, but it's a bit more expansive. The revision includes reagents that test to someone's predisposition to a medical condition or disease, as well as reagents that can predict treatment response or reactions in the definition of an IVD. By including them in the definition, these reagents are to be regulated as IVDs. Like I mentioned, there are a lot of new definitions in the revision. If we went over them all, this webinar would be really long and really boring, so I'll just mention some of them here. As you can see on this slide, devices for near-patient testing and companion diagnostic devices are included in this regulation and have definitions in their own right. The regulation puts an emphasis on post-market surveillance and vigilance, and so new definitions in that realm include serious adverse events are defined. Novel device and device for genetic testing are also included. The new definitions also include explanations of the new parties, their relationships, and more. It's worth a read to see if your IVD is included in the new definitions, and regardless, how you can start to get ahead of the regulatory curve. Let's now move on to the economic and regulatory operators, starting with the economic operators. To differentiate them from the regulatory actors, the proposed regulation defines economic operators as manufacturers, authorized representatives of non-EU manufacturers, importers, distributors, and the responsible person for regulatory compliance. In other words, everyone who gets the device from the drawing board to the shelf. Regulatory parties take over from that point. The economic operators that are described in the revision are, like I said, the manufacturers, distributors, importers, authorized representatives, and the responsible person for regulatory compliance. You'll see the different articles that describe their obligations in parentheses next to their name. According to the revision, a manufacturer is a natural or legal person who manufactures or fully refurbishes a device, or has a device designed, manufactured, or fully refurbished, and markets that device under his name or trademark. Unlike the directive, the revision doesn't include the manufacturer's obligations in the definition, but includes them in Article 8. Most of these duties are also found in the directive, except that the revision includes some specific requirements that a manufacturer's QMS must have, and that a post-market surveillance plan must be in place. A distributor is any natural or legal person in the supply chain, other than the manufacturer or the importer, who makes the device available on the market. Distributors and their obligations are new to the revision, as they weren't included in the directive. However, distributors were mentioned throughout the guidance documents and could have taken over some of the manufacturer's obligations, especially in terms of vigilance. Some of the duties that distributors have include not jeopardizing the IVD while in its care, informing the manufacturer of all the issues that arise with the device while in its care, and of any complaints that it receives. Importers are also new to the revision, which defines them as any natural or legal person established within the Union who places a device from a third country on the Union market. Importers have very similar obligations to those of distributors, especially when it comes to ensuring the manufacturer performs all the steps necessary to CE mark the device. If the importer has reason to believe that a device they import does not actually conform, it immediately informs the manufacturer and the authorized representative and can take any necessary corrective action to bring the device into conformity, withdraw it, or recall it. So importers have a bit more robust regulatory duty than in the directive. The fourth economic operator is the authorized representative. The authorized representative is a person established within the EU who has received and accepted a written mandate from the manufacturer to act on his behalf in relation to specified tasks with regard to the latter's obligations under the regulation. One major change is that the revision specifically includes points that must be included in the contract between the manufacturer and the authorized representative, and points that the manufacturer may not delegate to the authorized representative. Manufacturers must allow authorized representatives to keep technical documentation in the EU Declaration of Conformity and respond to and cooperate with requests from competent authorities, among other things. Another new economic operator is the person responsible for regulatory compliance. Instead of being a whole separate actor, the revision makes manufacturers and authorized representatives have at least one of these on their staff. The revision lays out the minimum duties for the person responsible for regulatory compliance, as well as the minimum education and experience criteria to be eligible. While you may already have this person on your staff, this is an important position for manufacturers to take a look at. Manufacturers have the duty to ensure that they have someone with the right education and background who is able to be the person responsible for regulatory compliance. Now, moving on to the regulatory actors, the revision doesn't define regulatory actor, but for our purposes, the regulatory actors are the parties involved in assessing and monitoring the regulatory compliance of the device. You'll see the parties on this slide: notified bodies, competent authorities, the EU Commission, and two new groups, Medical Device Coordination Group and the EU Reference Laboratories. We'll talk about the EU Reference Laboratories by themselves in a bit, but for now, let's focus on the other regulatory actors. So you may already know all about notified bodies. LNET is one, for example, and I'm sure you're familiar, or at least have heard about, our notification procedure. Well, one thing that the revision requires is that all notified bodies must be re-notified to the regulations. Previously, the notified bodies notification applications were assessed only by the individual member states' competent authorities. This time around, the notified body's application is assessed by the competent authority, the EU Commission, and the Medical Devices Coordination Group. We'll get into who the Medical Devices Coordination Group is in a little bit. Competent authorities are also not really new to the revision. Competent authorities are the member states' health authorities that control the individual IVD market authorizations in their country. For example, in France, we have the ANSM, in the UK, we have the MHRA, etc. The revision maintains the competent authorities' role in market surveillance for their member state, although it specifies some of their duties with respect to market surveillance. One important point is that the revision includes the obligation to cooperate with each other and the Commission in order to uniformly apply the regulation. The EU Commission is certainly not a new regulatory actor, although the revision does give it some new obligations and powers and specifics, and specifies some of the ones that it already had from the directive. For example, the Commission can challenge the competence of notified bodies and create implementing or delegating acts to make a change when it deems the change is necessary for the public health. Among other things, the revision also charges the Commission in setting up an electronic system on vigilance with the competent authorities. The directives already require this, which is now UTIMED, although the revision requires that more people have access to this database, and that the database has a few more things in it. The MDCG, or Medical Device Coordination Group, is established in Article 76, which is way back in the chapter entitled Cooperation Between Member States, Medical Device Coordination Group, EU Reference Laboratories, and Device Registers. So, the group arises out of a sense of cooperation among the member states to provide guidance and harmonize practices to notified bodies and manufacturers. The NDCG's tasks are listed in Article 77. One task that the NDCG has is to recommend a notified body to be notified to the regulation. One of the new players has some specific tasks related to IVDs. EU reference laboratories are used to provide technical and scientific assistance to the Commission, member states, and notified bodies to help them implement the regulation, as well as a few other tasks. For example, the EU reference laboratory also contributes to developing testing protocols for conformity assessments and collaborating to determine the best practices for conformity assessment procedures. Different laboratories can apply to be EU reference laboratories, and the revision lays out the criteria for their acceptance. Specifically for IVDs, EU reference laboratories verify the compliance of Class D IVDs, which are the highest risk class, with the applicable common technical specifications. They also have a hand in conformity assessments, as they test samples or batches of Class D devices according to Section 5.7 of Annex 8 and Section 5.1 of Annex 10. Excuse me. Now, I know I mentioned classification, and in just a second we will get into it. So, let's move on to classification. So, now that we have a definition, we know what would be covered by the IVD regulation, and we know who all the major players are and their responsibilities. Let's take a look at the new IVD classification scheme. As we've anticipated, the revision classifies IVDs into 4 classes based on the GHTF classification scheme. Class A are the lowest risk IVDs, and Class D are the highest risk. One thing that has come up in our discussions here at LME GMed is that the GHTF classification scheme still creates some differences in interpretation between jurisdictions that use it, which isn't in keeping with one of the Commission's objectives. Have no fear, however, as the Commission has also included clauses in the IVD revision that gives an obligation to the competent authorities to come to a consensus on things like classification. So this regulation will still help to iron out some of the wrinkles in the current regulatory scheme. Now let's take a closer look at the classes. On this slide, you'll see the table that you'll find in the European Commission's impact assessment on the changes in the IVD regulation. As you can see, there are 4 risk-based classes, ranging from A, which would be the lowest risk IVDs, to D, which would be the IVDs that test for the highest risk conditions and diseases. An example of Class A IVDs is a specimen receptacle, or instrument that the manufacturer intends to be used for in vitro diagnostic purposes. If you take a look at the classification rules in Annex 7, there aren't that many IVDs that are classified as Class D IVDs, except devices that are self-testing and don't test for a medically critical status, or is preliminary and requires laboratory follow-up to confirm. Class B is also a catch-all class, in that devices that aren't covered by the other more specific rules are automatically in Class B. Class C IVDs test for a variety of infectious diseases and other conditions where an erroneous result would result in an imminent, life-threatening situation for the patient or their offspring. Some examples of this include blood glucose self-tests, genetic tests, tests for STIs and other infectious diseases, prenatal screening, and patient selection, for example, for companion diagnostics. Finally, Class D IVDs are those that test for an agent that causes a life-threatening disease, transplant suitability, and determining different markers like blood typing, KID, CAL, Duffy, and rhesus systems. If you're a current IVD manufacturer, it's important to figure out which classification your IVD would fall into, as the conformity assessments that an IVD would go through depend on the class of the IVD. If you're an IVD manufacturer who currently can self-certify their IVD, you should pay special attention to this in order to predict the conformity assessment that your IVD would need to go through to maintain your CE marking when the regulation is finalized. Following the new classification scheme, there are also new conformity assessments that IVDs would go through. There are fewer choices for conformity assessments than in the IVD Directive, and they all require a review of the IVD technical documentation. The conformity assessments follow the classification routes. In Article 40 in the revision is where you'll find the choices for each class of IVD. A good thing to know, once you've determined the class, you can turn to this article to figure out your choices for conformity assessments. There are a lot more IVDs that would require intervention by a notified body to CE mark their IVDs, and only Class A IVDs are those that don't need to use a notified body for their CE marking and can self-declare. The conformity assessments themselves are familiar to those who currently go through them to CE mark their IVDs, but there are a few small changes. First, there are fewer of them. Second, even for the lower-risk devices in Class B, the conformity assessment based on full quality assurance is required. Classes C and D allow for a choice between a full quality assurance or type examination with a production quality assurance assessment. It's important to go through the article that explains the choices for each class, as there are exclusions and inclusions for each of the assessments that shouldn't be ignored. Now on this slide, you'll see a chart that details the conformity assessment and which classes can use which assessment. As you can see, full quality assurance, or Annex 8, is available for classes D, C, and B. Along with Annex 8, Class C devices also require a technical documentation sampling, where Class D devices have to send some of their samples or batches to the EU Reference Laboratory. Also note that Annex 8 states that the manufacturer should grant the notified body access to the technical documentation, regardless of the class. The conformity assessments in Annexes 9 and 10 are available for classes D and C. Notified bodies are required for all classes of IVDs, except those in Class A that aren't sterile, have a measuring function, or offer near-patient testing. Another major change is the inclusion of a summary of safety and clinical performance. This summary of safety and clinical performance is a report on the safety and clinical performance of the device based on the full information collected during the clinical performance study. But what is this clinical performance study? Well, we'll get into that in the next slide. But regardless, this report, this summary of safety and clinical performance, should be written such that a layperson can understand it, and it should be written in the official languages of the countries in which the IVD is marketed. Notified bodies look at and validate the drafts during their conformity assessments. This document is going to be a publicly available document, available on Udemy. So in the last slide, we talked about the summary of safety and clinical performance, and that the inputs to this document are the outputs of the clinical performance studies. But what are these clinical performance studies? The revision includes an entire chapter and annex that is devoted to clinical evidence and the requirements on clinical evidence. According to the definition, clinical performance means the ability of a device to yield results that are correlated with a particular clinical condition or physiological state, in accordance with the target population and intended user. The purpose behind having a clinical performance study is to establish or confirm aspects of the device's performance that can't be determined through non-clinical evaluations. Clinical evidence is evidence that shows how the IVD conforms with the general safety and performance requirements, and it is what the manufacturer uses to support their intended uses. The clinical evidence requirements chapter and annex also include the requirements for the clinical performance studies and how the manufacturer should gather clinical evidence. On this slide, you'll see the scope of what the revisions are calling clinical evidence, and you'll see that it's pretty broad. Phew, okay, well, that was a ton of information, and it was pretty dense. So let's do a recap. Today, we talked about the incoming IVD regulatory scheme and how it has changed in order to accommodate new technology while keeping a high level of health and safety. There has been a complete overhaul for the IVD regulatory scheme, including a new classification method, conformity assessments, and clinical evaluation requirements. Also, keep in mind that there are new regulatory requirements for economic and regulatory actors as well. And that concludes our webinar on the evolutions that are currently happening in the IVD regulatory scheme. We still have a ways to go until we get a final text for the IVD regulation, as it is currently being reviewed by the EU Council and has to go through another reading with the EU Parliament before it is finally voted upon. However, IVD manufacturers should keep abreast of the different changes to help bridge the gap between the directive and the regulation. We'll stick around for another 10 minutes or so to answer questions, so feel free to type them in the box. If we don't get to your question, don't worry. We'll answer them in the coming weeks. We're going to send around a copy of the slides, so if you miss something, you can be sure to have it seen. And with that, let's get started on the questions.